Let's start by filling in the string properties of our model, which means we will want to enter some text in the name and notes fields for an employee. First, I'll create a div to wrap a label and an input. The label will indicate what data we need to enter into the input, and the input is where we can enter the value for name. So the type equals at employee name. Let's also add some bootstrap classes to make it look nice. For the outer div, we'll use form group and a top margin of 3. For the label, we'll add the class form label, and for the input, we'll add the class form control. So we have a div that wraps a label and an input where we can enter data. I'll run this so you can see how it looks at this point. So we have a label and an input where we can enter some data, in this case the employee's name. So we link this input with the employee name. Now, depending on the data type, the input will have a different type. However, Blazor has several helper components, and instead of using the HTML input and setting the appropriate type as we have here, we will use a dedicated input component for each type in Blazor. For example, to enter text in Blazor, we use input text. So instead of using the HTML input, we use input text from Blazor. Similarly, as before, we can set bootstrap classes. We don't need to set the type here. We just need to bind this control to the employee name using bind value and set it to employee name. This is called data binding, meaning we bind this component specifically to the employee name. We will discuss data binding in more detail in the next lesson, but this is how we will usually do it when creating forms. For entering employee notes, although it is also text, we will want to add a multi-line text component called a text area, and we will use input text area for this purpose. To speed things up, I'll copy the entire div for the name and place a new one here for the notes. Instead of input text, we'll use input text area this way and change the label and binding. We want this input to be linked to employee notes. Okay. Additionally, we can set it by default to have 4 rows for this area component. Now I'll run the application and see how it looks. So on our form, we have the option to enter a name and employee notes. Now I invite you to the next lesson where I'll explain how data binding works in detail.